Welcome to your OSHA mandatory training for chemical protection. It is important to note that TMHOH does not have any chemical protection procedures outside of normal PPE such as hand, eye, face, foot, and hearing protection for most of its associates. Some at TMHOH have to be trained and tested for respirators, VOC controls, and electrolyte compounds. This training is to make you aware of our ever-changing customer base that requires more stringent chemical protection procedures while at their facility. After completing this training, you should be able to explain the general requirements for chemical protective clothing, describe how to properly store PPE, and also describe proper inspection and documentation procedures. The manufacturer of your protective clothing will be the only authority on the following: proper use and maintenance of selected protective clothing, including capabilities and limitations. It is important to know while the manufacturer can tell you from what and for how long the clothing can protect you for, the manufacturer of the chemical compounds will be the only leading authority on the hazards and consequences of not using protective clothing. General requirements that you must know before using protective clothing or devices. The human factors influencing protective clothing performance. Instructions for inspecting, putting on and taking off, checking, fitting, and using protective clothing. You should also know your responsibility, if any, for decontamination, cleaning, maintenance, and repair of protective clothing. Emergency procedures and self-rescue in the event of protective clothing or equipment failure. It is important that you understand that no single combination of protective equipment and clothing is capable of protecting you against all hazards. No material protects against all chemicals and combinations of chemicals, and no currently available material is an effective barrier to any prolonged chemical exposure. Chemical mixtures can be significantly more aggressive towards protective clothing than any single chemical alone. Some situations may involve unidentified substances. However, the discomfort and inconvenience of wearing protective clothing and equipment can create resistance to your willingness to use it. One essential aspect of this training is to make you aware of the need for protective clothing and to motivate the proper use and maintenance of it. Use of protective clothing under normal conditions allows employees to become familiar with how it feels wearing the protective clothing. This way you know how it should feel before danger of exposure is possible. Chemical protective clothing and equipment shields or isolates individuals from the chemical, physical, and biological hazards that may be encountered during operations that involve hazardous substances. It is not always apparent when chemical exposure occurs. Many chemicals pose no visible hazards and offer no warning properties. Our customers have selected protective clothing by evaluating its performance, characteristics against the requirements and limitations imposed by the hazards they face. The use of protective clothing can itself create significant hazards for the wearer, such as heat stress, physical and psychological stress, impaired vision, mobility, and communication. Thus, both underprotection and overprotection can be hazardous and should always be avoided. Components of protective clothing are purchased separately, but must be combined to provide both appropriate protection and to allow personnel to perform their duties. The combined parts are known as ensembles. Various combinations of the following components can form a complete protective clothing ensemble, such as protective suits, coveralls, hoods, gloves, or boots. This also includes respiratory equipment. These devices and garments can also include communication devices, head protection, eye protection, ear protection, and inner garments that also protect you from the chemical exposure. Combinations of the following can form a complete protective clothing ensemble. Outer garments, such as over gloves, over boots, or splash guards. Each ensemble may be tailored to the specific hazard at hand. In choosing pieces of protective clothing, consider the following factors: chemical hazards, physical environment, and duration of exposure. These all play into what you should be wearing at the time that you are exposed to chemical hazards. Each ensemble must be tailored to the specific hazard. Consider these factors: protective clothing or equipment's availability. Depending on the hazard involved, some clothing may be decontaminated and reused. Some, however, should be used only once. A telltale sign would be that it is marked or sold as disposable protection. You should also base your selection on material chemical resistance, including factors of chemical hazard permeation, degradation, and penetration of the protective garment. All parts of these ensembles should fit together and not allow for any exposure to the chemical compounds. During emergencies, it is not the right time to discover problems with protective clothing. So make sure that any protective equipment or clothing is in good working order through regular inspections, proper storage, and care set forth by the manufacturer. This step, plus realizing protective clothing and equipment limitations, is the best way to avoid chemical exposure during normal use or emergency response. An effective chemical protection clothing inspection program features 5 different inspections: when equipment is received from the factory or distributor, when equipment is selected for a particular chemical operation, after use or training and before maintenance, during storage. When questions arise as the appropriateness of selected equipment or when problems with similar equipment are discovered. Keep records of these inspections to track maintenance and condition of protective clothing. Chemical protective clothing will only be effective if it is appropriate for the job and if it is in good condition. Inspect your chemical protective clothing before you use it and watch for damage during use. Clothing must be stored properly to prevent damage or malfunction from exposure to dust, moisture, sunlight, damaging chemicals, extreme temperatures, and impact. Make sure you are aware of the following guidelines for storage of the chemical protective clothing. Store potentially contaminated clothing or materials separately from street clothes or unused protective clothing. Store potentially contaminated clothing in a well-ventilated area with good airflow around each item, if possible. Store clothing and gloves by design and material to keep from mixing them up and grabbing the wrong material by mistake. Also, fold or hang protective clothing according to manufacturer's instructions. Knowing what to do with contaminated PPE or chemical clothing, that is how to remove and dispose of or launder contaminated clothing without contaminating themselves or the facility. Decontamination protects users from hazardous substances that may contaminate and eventually permeate the protective clothing, such as respiratory equipment, tools, vehicles, and other equipment used in the vicinity of the chemical hazard. Decontamination also protects all personnel by minimizing the transfer of harmful materials into other areas. It also helps prevent mixing of incompatible chemicals, and it protects the community by preventing uncontrolled transportation of contaminants from the site. After completing this training, you should now be able to explain the general requirements for chemical protective clothing, describe how to properly store PPE, and describe proper inspection procedures. This includes your OSHA mandated training for chemical protection. Have a safe day.